Okay, we're now into the 19th century, starting in the year 1800, and even though the United States has been the first country that's had a real democratic revolution, as part of really a rebellion against its colonizing country, the whole idea of a democratic revolution has spread very, very far, and a lot of the advocates of it are Masonic and Masonic liberals, etc. There's developing a sense of what we call liberal nationalism, where nations want to be identified separately and have their own cultures and their own languages, and have a constitution. And the idea of what's been done over in the Americas is something that's very attractive to Europeans. However, there is a very bloody civil war and revolution in France that is not at all like what happened in the United States. It really was not throwing off the chains of a colonizer. It was really a horrible civil war, and the French Revolution came through. But the French also were very extreme in their philosophies, and there was a tremendous amount of anti-clericalism, because it was the wealthy classes of people and the royal and the aristocrats and the church that were all tied together, and draining most of the middle class and certainly the peasantry of their resources and opportunities. So we had this bloody French Revolution, and that resulted basically in the complete deinstitutionalization of the Roman Catholic Church in France. And that had been a very powerful kind of setup in France with the French royalty and the church and so on for a long, long time. And people tried to do all kinds of funny things, like invent a new religion and new gods, the god of liberty and the goddess of liberty, and they changed the calendar, they changed everything, and they went very, very far in a revolutionary sense that finally resulted in so much disaster that many people were opposed to what the government had become, and finally resulted in the ascendancy and the coming to power of Napoleon. But the result of that was really the end of the power of the church in France, and that really was the beginning of the end of the Inquisition. It wasn't the end of the Inquisition, but it was the beginning of the end of the Inquisition and all the powers of the church. And so after that, we got, coming out of the closet, all these esoteric groups and organizations and orders, whether they were Masonic orders or Rosicrucian orders, that had been part of what we call the underground stream, the alternative forms of spirituality and religion that were hidden within communities and hidden from the Inquisition. So that's what we're going to talk about happening in this century. The constitutional democracies didn't emerge just right away. There were many attempts, and even halfway through the 19th century, there were many attempts at coups and the establishment of democracies and democratic governments and overthrowing the kings and queens, and they failed. But the whole thing was in the air, and we had the rise of a movement we know today as Romanticism, and politically national liberalism. Liberalism isn't the same thing as we think of as liberalism today. It was basically nationalism and a desire for a nation to be under its own control and not under the control of churches or other kinds of things. And Romanticism was a whole view of life, about life and nature, that was very much in sync with the Hermetic view of things. And it had to do with throwing off all the ideas of Christianity and the church about nature. When the Puritans came over to this country, their attitude was this. Now I'm talking about the Puritans now, not the other colonizers. The wilderness was a place where Satan lived and the devil lived. And the wilderness had to be conquered. It had to be cut down. And the savages had to be converted or whatever to their religion. And so going into the country, they were heroes that were like conquering demons and exorcising land. And the earth and the land were essentially inimical. They were enemies. Nature and the physical world was an enemy of the divine world. And that was the kind of idea. Well, in Romanticism, nature and the world were part of the divine world. They were, in fact, seen and understood as an extension of the divine world, as you do in Hermetic philosophy, as above, so below, and so on. And it became the subject of poetry and literature and all kinds of things, and the kind of gospel of Romanticism spread very quickly through theater and many other kinds of things. The idea of constitutional democracy was very strongly supported and actually initiated by Masonic fraternities. The Freemasons and all the different kinds of Freemasonic fraternities and organizations were the ones that had developed voting as a means of selecting leadership. Originally, there were two ways that Masons were, that a Grand Master was appointed. He could be appointed by royalty for life, and that was generally done with a Grand Master who was a true adept, and there were many who were. But there were also many buffoons who were appointed in this way, and you got a reaction against that by the Masons themselves, and they kind of overthrew them, and so they started going back to the Greek system of casting stones, a white stone and a black stone, or they had different methods for casting ballots. How do we do it now in Freemasonry? Do we still use the stones and the ballots?
Yeah, little white balls with black cubes.
Yeah, and that was the Greek method of voting, and it was anonymous. Nobody knew how to vote it. Yeah.
You only one who can see the ballot. You just pick the one up you want and drop it in the hole, and then you pull out the ballot later, and 3 people check it.
And that was the basis for what was written into our Constitution and what became the whole idea of democracy and voting and so on. And what they did is vote for their Grand Masters, and they actually changed Grand Masters every so many years. And that was the idea that was eventually brought into the United States government of a president who would be elected every so many years and so on. It's too bad we don't have the idea of vote of no confidence for a parliament today, because we could sure use it in this country. But anyway. So the whole social and political power of the Roman Catholic Church ended. The suppression, therefore, of all this underground stream by the Inquisition was starting to grind to a halt, because there wasn't any social support for the power of the public power of the Inquisition by doing the Inquisition, by punishing people in public, by burning them, by hanging them, by torturing them in public. That was a great way to keep power, and for it to feel that God was behind all of this and this is the correct way to do things. Well, that kind of support fled. And so formerly secret schools became visible, and they came out of the closet, so to speak. These were Rosicrucians, Gnostics, Freemasonic schools, non-Christian groups of all kinds, and that became the kind of freedom. The whole issue of religious freedom that was championed by Thomas Jefferson, by which he meant, he wasn't talking about Buddhism and Hinduism and Confucianism. He was talking about different denominations of Christianity, and even tolerating the Catholics, as we did in Maryland. You know, the Catholics were all tarred and feathered by the Puritans, and the only place they could escape to was the land of Mary, the Virgin Mary, which is called Maryland, and so that became Catholic. But so this is the trend that we see at the beginning of the century. We have to talk about Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the mysticism of nature. He was kind of the cheerleader for all this movement, and bringing it into philosophy, etc. Other people, in terms of political philosophy, had written many things, but Rousseau brought this philosophy into a spiritual kind of philosophy. You find even later on that the church, the hymns that people sing in Christian churches, especially the ones for Christmas and so on that we all know, you know, Silent Night and Joy to the World, and all, these are all romantic church hymns, and they were liberal church hymns, and they were brought in through this permeate, the way that Romanticism permeated Protestantism, and it permeated Catholicism as well. So it epitomized the Enlightenment spirit, the Hermetic spirit, the idea that the earth was sacred, and that what happened in nature was not something that was demonic and possessed, but nature itself was beautiful and was an expression of the divine. And therefore, not only nature, but man, the divinity of man, something that was maintained in the Hermetic tradition for a long time, was very important, and especially unspoiled man that had not been spoiled by the minds, and the evil in the world was that which came through the minds of human beings. The Inquisition was evil. Unjust government was evil. These kinds of things were the evils of the world. And so people that didn't experience that, they didn't have government, and they didn't have the Catholic Church, and they didn't have this. They were savages. They were noble. The noble savage. They were people that were pure human beings that had not been made impure by European civilization, and all the crusts and formations of it that occurred down all over the centuries had escaped the influence of corruption, and so people went there. They lionized and thought the most wonderful people were the American Indians, or the people in the South Pacific Islanders. I mean, painters like Van Gogh and his friends would go and live on the islands, and even marry people and do their paintings there and things like that. So the idea of a noble savage became important. The idea of a social contract, the idea that as Yeshua said, man was not made for the Sabbath was made for man, when he argued about people. They would argue that people were not made to serve the government was made to serve people. Very radical idea. It was written into the Declaration of Independence, but the idea of a social contract between power and people, and that it was an equal covenant that went between them, and there had to be checks and balances both ways. So we have many writings of people, Voltaire and Royal Society, and all the people, members of the earliest scientific societies like Locke and so on. They developed these democratic concepts of human dignity and the rights of man and things like this at this time. The philosophy of the French Revolution was based on that. The actual realities of the way it was carried out was a little bit different, and that's too bad. But inspired all kinds of poetry and art and literature, and we know the movement as Romanticism. And the Romantic poets became the bards of this new thought. And even earlier, Shakespearean actors had become kind of the forefront of Hermetic thought and new thought back in the 17th century and the 18th century. The theater also remained a place for putting forth these new ideas, and literature did, and so on. Women started writing novels under the names of men, and all kinds of interesting things happened. Now, here are some of the European occult schools that developed after the French Revolution. The Gnostic ecclesiae, the Gnostic churches, Templar groups, Egyptian Freemasonry, which we're going to talk about the whole Romantic Egyptian thing in a minute, the alchemical, especially the French Freemasonic rites. Our Pan-Sophic was originally based on the alchemical rites of the French Grand Lodge that we were established by. One of the I'm going to mention the term vitriol. Vitriol refers to an alchemical, to sulfuric acid, or acids that dissolve things even your skin, and they're considered to be universal solvents and so on. But the letters of the name vitriol became, the 7 letters became the key kind of glyph for the development of the Philosopher's Stone. You'll find these words here. Let's see if we can find them. Visita interiora terra. Go to the interior of the earth. Rectificando invenies occultum lapidum. This will bring to you the Philosopher's Stone. This is another alchemical thing, seven-pointed star, each of them with these words. This is in French Freemasonry, especially in the alchemical, among the alchemical Freemasons, this is still a mystical word. It's part of the teachings that you get actually in the not in the apprentice grade, but in the fellowcraft grade. Napoleon, who became the political lion of democracy, he was going to overthrow all the rulers and the kings and the monarchs and help all countries to become democratic. That was what his conquests were all about, supposedly. Had the loyalty of people like Beethoven, who wrote the Emperor Concerto and so on. But after Napoleon had gone on for about 4 years with his wars, sort of like George Bush, they got very unpopular. And people started to hate Napoleon. And when he's finally defeated, everybody celebrated. Because war was not a really very nice way to do these things. And so Beethoven, struck out the name, the dedication to Napoleon later on in his Emperor Concerto and so on. But Napoleon's conquests politically changed Europe by quite a bit. One of the things that happened, he made a trip to Egypt and to and brought scholars with him to try to discover some of the secrets of Egypt, because everybody considered Egypt to be the great storehouse of antiquity or of esoteric and hermetic knowledge, and but no one had been able to translate the Egyptian language. In fact, that wouldn't happen for 30 years until the Rosetta Stone was found, which had the same thing written in Demotic and in Egyptian characters and in Greek. And then people started to understand how the language worked, although there were many theories at that time. But another place they went is they basically came and stormed Rome, and they took documents out of the Vatican. One of the scholars that went with him was a fellow named Levy. Levy was a Catholic priest. He was a Jesuit priest, but he was an esotericist above all. And he had a chance to observe many, many documents, and the Vatican Library is still a closed place that holds all kinds of secrets about history, especially about esoteric orders and things like that. A lot of these documents were made public by someone like Levy. The Egyptian research was finally started in this century because of the Rosetta Stone. Eliphas Levi, came to England and taught much of what he knew to a fellow named Kenneth Mackenzie. And the English school of occultism, of Kabbalah and of Hermetic studies and things like this was revitalized as a Rosicrucian kind of movement through the work of Eliphas Levi, and he and Mater and some other people had studied a lot of there was a whole new impetus for looking back into what had been before untouchable and unknowable, the whole esoteric history of Europe, and so these people were bringing these things forth. This is Kenneth Mackenzie, who is very responsible for an awful lot of the occult and esoteric knowledge that finally came forth publicly in England by the middle of the century. This is the Baphomet, which is a drawing under the direction of Eliphas Levi of what religion would consider to be the devil, but was actually a symbol, an alchemical symbol. You see, he has breasts, and he's got male, and he's female, and he's horned, and he has wings, and different kinds of things. As got the moon and the sun and all that. Is a sort of an androgynous symbol, like you would, rather terrifying looking, but just like you would find in Tibetan Buddhism or other kinds of things, and Hindu religion and so on. The Baphomet was a symbolic, a symbol of esoteric understandings of deity. And of course that led to the ideas that there was devil worship and all this among these people. These were symbolic drawings. That's why they would say there's devil worship among the Hindus and all this sort of thing.
At what time was that Baphomet image created?
He created that about halfway through the 19th century. It's based on other things. It was based, I think, on, it was drawn for him by others. It was based on verbal descriptions, I think, of it. So it wasn't an image that was really available in this way before.
Because that image has been tied with masonry and stuff going back well before the 19th century.
Oh yes, it was definitely tied with masonry and Templarism, but it wasn't drawn.
But the Templars wouldn't have that image. They might have the ideas.
Oh, they might. Yeah, they might have an image. They would have an image of an androgynous deity. They could have other ideas too, but the image itself that we're looking at was the one that was drawn and put together by Levy, and I'm not aware that there were actual images that we find in Freemasonry. Do you find images like that in Freemasonry, Jorge?
No, only in ancient Masonic material.
Yeah, and anti-Masonic material, of course. And where else can you find
why would they make a figure of deity look negative?
It doesn't look. It doesn't look negative to an occultist. It's male, female. It's like an angel. It's neither male nor female. It's both male and female. If you have ever studied the iconography of Hinduism or Tibetan Buddhism or anything else, you'll know that there are all kinds of terrible-looking, horrible-looking things that are aspects of deity, of God, and they represent powers of God. And this represents the many kinds of things like this, but it is interpreted, of course, in a demonic fashion.
Yeah.
Then we had the revival. By this time, by the later part of the 19th century, many of the old orders in Freemasonry were not quite extinct. They still had their charters and things, but they weren't operating because there were new forms that were there. So, for example, Yarker, John Yarker, who was the Grand Master of the London Lodge and who was the person who initiated Blavatsky into Masonry, which was a big no-no at the time. He is the one who got the charters and revived and preserved all these ancient esoteric forms of Freemasonry in what we call the ancient, it's spelled like antient, the ancient forms of Freemasonry that Pansophic is beholden to. I forgot to mention before him the rise of European spiritualism. Out of the seances and the kind of spiritualist movements that were happening in France before the Revolution and after the Revolution, and we'll look at Anton Mesmer and so on, the idea of spiritualism became very important. The idea of life after death and communication with people after death. Allan Kardec and many other people were people who were the head figures in some of those movements. So we had spiritualist movements, except they would be called Spiritism really at that time. And then we had the collection of Freemasonic, the old Freemasonic orders, and then the bringing together of new Freemasonic orders, which would be Egyptian orders and so on. Then we had in Rosicrucianism the Gold and Rosy Cross, which would develop mostly in Germany. And this is the symbol that I use, the Gold and Rosy Cross, with the eagles, the double eagle at the top and so on. These are highly symbolic things that we use to represent this period. You know, there's alchemical symbols and other kinds of things. And the Gold and Rosy Cross, especially a very large segment of it was involved, a couple of lodges in what were called the Asiatic Brethren. And these were people who had brought over from India and from the Far East knowledge about things like the tattvas and other kinds of esoteric knowledge that were known to Hinduism, and combined it with things like geomancy, which came through the Druidic roots and so on. And so the Asiatic Brethren had brought much that was Hindu and Buddhist into Western occultism, and had been doing that for a long time, but they were most active then.
Is it that the Druids were not active or had faded away by this time, by this century?
Oh yeah, there were no Druids.
They
were just, Wicca and witchcraft and so on were just revivals in the 20th century of things that people thought maybe had existed, but they didn't. They didn't exist really in that way. But and then there was the development of German occultism. Nietzsche, who wrote "Thus Spake Zarathustra" and other important things that influenced a lot of people, not the least of whom was Adolf Hitler, about man and Superman and so on. German occultism developed in which they felt that all human religion was weakening humanity, and it was anti-humane and anti-human, and it needed to. It was part of the ancient past that needed to be dropped. This is an attitude very much like you found in the French Revolution, right after the Revolution, when they tried to create their own new kind of future religion with new terms and new months and new days and new years and so on. Start the year one with the French Revolution. And in German occultism, this same kind of impulse led to the complete overthrow, the idea of overthrowing and discarding and getting rid of these negative religious ideas in Christianity and Judaism and Hinduism and any other kind of religion. And that developed the various kinds of German occult schools. And I'll talk about the Vril Society and the Thule societies. These were groups that developed in German occultism that were the precursors to the idea of the German super race and all this sort of thing, and the idea of superiority of some races to others. Now, this whole business of racism was developed scientifically after the 1850s. The idea that there were some races that were retarded and some that were not, and people were developed and were grouped by races, by the color of their skin and where they lived and so on. If you go to the website of the Anthropological Society, the National Association of Anthropologists in this country, they have a big statement right on the front that says there is no such thing as race. Race is a phony thing that was invented in the 19th century. There are more differences, genetic differences, between two people of the same so-called race who live next door to each other in Kansas City than there are between two peoples of so-called different races. And the color of skin simply tells you how close to the equator someone's ancestors lived for thousands of years. And the shape of the face and the nose and all that kind of stuff. So there is actually one race, and what definition of a race is will describe all humanity. Unless we find another race of humanity, such as Neanderthals that may have survived as Bigfoots or something, we're all one race. And we just have different shades of skin and different kinds of noses and things like that, but we're all one race. But racism was invented scientifically and became a very basic, the impulse for a lot of things in the late 1900s, the middle to the late 1900s, and German occultism was right up on top of all this stuff right there at that time. It's very interesting. Some people, a musician that some people just love, like Richard Wagner, was the biggest racist you ever heard. He just hated Jews, and his wife even hated them worse. We have one of her letters when there was a fire in a theater and 100 Jews burned to death. She wrote a glorious, ecstatic letter about, oh, I'm so happy, I'm so joyful because the Jews have burned and all this kind of stuff. Now, there's two kinds of anti-Semitism. The older kind was the Christian anti-Semitism developed by the Catholic Church, which is basically that the Jews are Christ killers and that's why we hate them. But this is a new kind of anti-Semitism that developed in the 19th century. It was basically the idea that Jews were people that hung on to these old, outmoded forms of religion, and also many of them were landholders and bankers and things like this, because in the earlier medieval period, the only Christians couldn't, by the rules of Jesus, couldn't charge interest for loans and things, although they finally found a way around it. The Pope or someone gave them an excuse for it. And so therefore they had to get loans. The only people who gave them loans were Jews because they didn't have any rules against it. And so you got the House of Rothschild and many Jewish lending things, and they became landlords, and the very few wealthy Jews that there were. And so the Jews were hated, and this whole business of the worldwide Jewish conspiracy and all this was born at that time with racism and
And if
everything.
anybody knows Jewish people, you know that they quarrel and disagree too much to organize a conspiracy.
Absolutely. Now, Freemasonry was very strong with political revolution and had a great deal to do, for example, with Italian reunification. Italy was not a country. It was not a nation. It was basically under the ownership of the Catholic Church. Well, under some of the great heroes of the Italian Revolution, Garibaldi and the Carbonari, who were his soldiers, they reclaimed Italy as a state, and basically what the Pope's holdings were scaled back to just a part of the city of Rome, which we now know as the Vatican City. So that's what happened to all the secular holdings of the Catholic Church. They finally lost them in that big national revolution that produced the nation we know as Italy. Now, in England, the Romantic movement had a lot of people that were associated with it. One of the most important was William Blake. Blake was a man who was basically Gnostic in his point of view, and he was also a person who drew or carved woodcuts and things like this, and books. And he was part of a movement with people like Wordsworth and Lord Byron and Coleridge and Shelley and some of these great poets. I put a little link here on the page if you would like to go to some of the electronic books that show the illustrations of Blake that are esoteric illustrations from the earlier part of the 19th century. You can go to the internet and see them. These are
Blake archive?
Yeah, well, it's just right there. You just click on it when you have access online. Just go click, and it'll come right on. This is these are some of the illustrations he did from his Gnostic stories, and they're incredible illustrations. They're very highly esoteric, and of course, as you can see, some of them are very grotesque, sort of like bafflement and all that sort of thing. But what did he write? Well, the Song of Loss, who talks about the demiurge Urizen, who creates the world, and the Kabbalistic creation of the world. And there are many other of these things. This is a whole world to investigate. I'm just introducing you to it now. But this is a part of the English Gnostic heritage that existed before there was an actual English Gnostic church. The English Gnostic ecclesiae actually were chartered later in the century. Another great writer was Bulwer Lytton. His novel Zanoni. His novel I strongly suggest that someday, if you ever have time to read a novel, you might want to read Zanoni. It's a classic esoteric novel from the early part of the 19th century. In fact, my novel, which was originally called The Astral Man, and then after Dr. Whitworth got his hands on it, we call it From Astral Man to Cosmic Christ, but was, we have Dr. E. Nonaz in my book, whose name is Zanoni spelled backwards, and a reference to some of these things. But Zanoni is a great occult novel. On the positive side, it became very popular, and it was, there were no movies then and no television, so this was a great way that a lot of esoteric ideas were spread in England. It inspired a whole genre of literary occultism. On the negative side, his novel Vril, The Black Sun, became an emblem and a badge for all the racist Nazi-type groups about the idea of superior human races and things like this, which unfortunately I don't think Bulwer Lytton intended to do. this is called Vril, the power of the coming race. And if you want to read it, sometimes it's very interesting. It tells about a fellow who's taken into the race of people that live in the center of the earth. They were driven underground a long time ago. And they have all these advanced powers and things like this, and they're going to eventually come back to the surface and all this sort of thing. This is where the whole civilization at the center of the earth bit that people are still doing comes from. The power at the center of the earth was called Odin power, and later it was simply known as Od, and you will hear it referred to in some theosophical literature as this special power that is the psychic power. The Vril societies were formed around this, about people that have read this, and there was a great fascination among the Germans with the Teutonic Knights and occultism. The Teutonic Knights were the German chivalric orders that had defended Germany against Catholic incursions, but were also defending Germany against any kind of invasion, and so they became symbolic of the purity of Germany. And the German Vril Society was formed, and they believed in extraterrestrials. This is like in the last century. And they still survive today. And in the early 20th century, we had the Thule Society. Adolf Hitler was a member of the Thule Society. The Thule Society supported a lot of the ideas that contributed to what would become National Socialism, Nazism, and the ideas of German racial superiority. The other thing that happened that was important in this century was a tremendous fascination with Egypt. There was kind of a whole romance of Egypt. There were Isean temples, temples of Isis that were in ruins. They were actually temples of Serapis. That's Osiris plus Apis, the two deities, scattered all over Italy and in the Mediterranean, half sunk in the water, with fascinating Egyptian images. And so Europeans would see these and come up with all kinds of fascinating ideas about them. They may well have been the source for many of the tarot images that were used. In the Renaissance, there were translations of iamblicists and the Neoplatonists and the classical historians that talked a lot about Egypt, and they went back to a priest they call Manetho, who told them stories about the more esoteric parts of Egyptian religion, etc. Remember, Hermetism is from Hermes, but Hermes is Thoth. And Thoth Hermes is the origin of the Hermetic movement, and Hermes Trismegistus is the Egyptian Thoth. And then, of course, there were the Gypsies. Now, the Gypsies were actually from India. They came in around the 900s and so on. And they had all kinds of mysterious occult knowledge, but because as they were kicked around all over Europe, they would read poems and do things like that. People thought that their esoteric knowledge must have come from Egypt, because that would be the source for all the Europeans. And so they called them the Gypsies, which meant they were from Egypt. And so the Gypsies were happy to pander to that idea and tell them, oh yeah, we're all from Egypt and all that kind of stuff, and we have all the knowledge of Egypt and all that. So that's another thing. But the basis of all occult knowledge in the Hermetic world was the Egyptian Hermes Trismegistus, Thoth Hermes. And so this became very powerful. We had Egyptian tarot decks and parlor games that were invented at this time. At the end of the 18th century, an archaeologist, the Count de Gobelin, made the following pronouncement: the Book of Thoth from ancient Egypt, I'm just quoting him exactly, he called it Thoth, exists, and its pages correspond to the images of the tarots. And so his idea was that tarot was invented by Thoth Hermes and supposedly used by Egyptian priests for divinatory purposes and initiation rites. This idea became popular all over France, and then at the height of the Egyptian craze, everybody believed in it. and Napoleon went to Egypt and brought back Egyptian artifacts, and then people wanted to get Egyptian translated. Well, because nobody could translate it yet, they could come up with all kinds of great ideas about it, and so there was a lot of fantasy. So the Egyptian tarot decks were invented. These are not actually, the first one was the, actually it isn't Count de Gibelin, it's the Court de Gibelin, but it means something like that. His name was Court de Gibelin. And so Egyptian tarot decks appeared as maybe the first occult forms of tarot. And then Cagliostro developed his Egyptian rites of Freemasonry. And these were based on, you know, the ultimate esoteric stuff. That involved even going through a 40-day process in which you took mercury and lost your teeth in your hair, and you would regenerate yourself and become 50 years younger. Of course, most people died trying to do it. But yeah. And then, of course, Napoleon made his military excursion to Egypt, brought back a lot of things. And finally, the translation of Egyptian hieroglyphics was made possible. And we had a whole development of, after Cagliostro, who was the grand poobah of his order, he went around to all the Masonic groups and established Egyptian Masonic rites. After that, in the 19th century, we had Freemasonic Egyptian rites. They were called the rites of Memphis and the rites of Mesmerism. Mesmerism is simply the name for Egypt, means Egypt. And Memphis was a city in Egypt where things, and then you got them combined as the rites of Memphis and Mesmerism. And they nearly became the basic higher orders of Freemasonry in the United States and in other parts of the world. They competed with the York Rite from England, and they competed with the Scottish Rite. But Scottish Rite eventually won out in this country, and now the only place you can find the rites of Memphis and Mesmerism are in the archives, and just 30 or 33 degrees or something of it. And then among esoteric groups. They become what we call, some people simply call them phony Masonic. Well, they're not phony because they have real charters, but many regular Masons denigrate these orders that went on that way as trans-Masonic or ultra-Masonic, or is a positive way of saying it. The negative way of saying it is, I forgot what they said, but you know, lots of negative.
Clandestine.
Well, clandestine isn't negative enough. There's something else. Anyway, moving on. If you want to learn about the development of Tarot, I would suggest that you go to Bishop Christine Payne-Towler's Tarot sites. Her site is tarotuniversity.com, and her book, The Underground Stream. This is Bishop Christine. She's one of the bishops of our synod. I consecrated her. And this is what her page looks like online. And she also has a big blog, and she has some articles by me and some other things, but she does a lot of research into Tarot and the history of esoteric Tarot. So she's a good source if you want to go online. So now we have all these sources we've studied are producing a form of esoteric Freemasonry in the 19th century that's gone beyond just the Freemasons interested in alchemy and Rosicrucianism and Templarism and so on. We have now higher orders developing beyond the first three orders, the order of an apprentice and a fellowcraft and a master. Scottish Rite Masonry develops higher and higher orders, higher and higher degrees. And what happens is these degrees memorialize occult schools that existed in Europe, existed in spite of the Inquisition. But they memorialize them in a very short snippet kind of way. They basically teach you a little bit about it, and you learn some knowledge, and then you receive a little degree that tells you you're now 25th or 18th or something degree Scottish Rite Mason, then you receive the Order of the Rosy Cross or something like that. Now, some of the oldest are the orders of Kilwinning and Herodom. I just want to show you a military map made in 1750 by General Roy for a war against the Jacobites, who were the people that were rebelling against the English, wanted to take over as English kings. Here we have a map of Kilwinning and Mount Harrodom, which is around that particular area, and this is the map that was made for the battle. And this is what these territories were called. These were not orders. These were not orders of Masonry. And as in the 19th century, as the higher perfection degrees of the Scottish rites were developed, the Order of Harrodom of Kilwinning and the Rose Cross of Kilwinning and the Order of Harrodom and so on were developed. This is where they were developed, and these were supposedly areas that were around Jerusalem, but they were actually in Scotland. So it was the Order of Harrodom, and the knowledge of that was supposedly given on a sacred mountain in Judea and reestablished in Scotland. And in fact, it's a grove of trees on a slight hill not far from Kilwinning Abbey. If we take a look here, we can see Bensley Woods. It's the same area, Mount Harrodom. And it was probably a Scottish sacred grove that was a Druidic sacred grove. And Scottish Rite was finally formalized in the U.S. during the 19th century, and it became very, very active. It still is today, and has probably the least understood series of Masonic higher degrees in the U.S. It supplanted the Egyptian rites, which were very popular in the U.S. in the 19th century, and now it really is the most successful higher degree set of rites in Freemasonry. And this is what there is in the Scottish Rite Masonry. You go all the way from the 4th degree, which is after just becoming a master, 1st, 2nd, 3rd degree, all the way to an administrative degree, the 33rd. The very top degrees are usually administrative. They're not so much things that people are initiated into. And so you might notice that there are the Rose Cross, and there are Elu, which are priests of the 12, priests of the 15. There are various kinds of knights, and so on. You will also find Templar orders, Knights of the Temple, that sort of thing. And so basically, these are higher and higher degrees are added in the 19th century to Freemasonry. These guys, they didn't have any television, and, no football, and Monday Night Football. They didn't have a lot to do, so they did this stuff, And boy, they sure did it. It got to be quite a thing, developing all these higher degrees and all these things. Today, if you're a Mason and you want to be initiated in these degrees, instead of taking your whole life to be initiated, you can do it in a weekend because it's all there. That's how it's done. And then we'd have to talk about the ultra-Masonic and the male-female rites of Freemasonry that developed in the 19th century. The rites of Memphis and the rites of Mesmerism were brought together or synthesized or created by Italian and French Freemasons. There was a fellow named Marconis, who was the Italian guy. He developed the rites of Memphis. And there was Bederide, who developed the rites of Egyptian rites he was French, the rites of Mesmerism, which came on the coattails of Cagliostro's Egyptian Freemasonry. And today the rites of Mesmerism were abbreviated to 33 degrees, and they competed with the Scottish Rite into the middle of the 19th century, and they didn't really survive. Scottish Rite is what really won out, and that's why you have Scottish Rite temples today. But we keep the 33 degrees in the College of Rites. So if you're a Mason, you can go to the College of Rites and get the 33 degrees of the rites of Mesmerism. The synthesis into the Masonic rites of Memphis of Mesmerism are still accepted by the Grand Orient. They're still a living form, and both women and men are members of this, as opposed to just men. The charter for Memphis, Mesmerism, and the ancient and primitive rites of Freemasonry and other ultramasonic rites, etc., as well as European esoteric orders, were all developed, and then they were transmitted by John Yarker, who at the end of the 19th century was the Grand Master of the London Lodge, and he is the person who passed on through other Masons to me the rites that we call the Pansophic rites today, the esoteric rites of Freemasonry. That's Yarker. One of the things that he did that made him very infamous was he supposedly initiated Madame Blavatsky as a Mason, and I don't know whether he actually did, but at that time, at the end of the 19th century, there were big agitation and movements for women to be admitted as Masons, and they finally were in France. The Lodge of Human Rights all voted to become a separate obedience. If the entire lodge of Masons votes unanimously to separate itself or to form a new obedience, which means like a new denomination, then it's legitimate. It's legitimately charters itself, and that's what they did, and they admitted women, and it still is going. We have in the United States and other places what we call a lot of theosophists and so on were members of what do we call that kind of Masonry? We call it
well, it's like male, female, co-masonry.
Co-masonry, yeah, that's what it's usually referred to.
Co-ed,
Yeah,
co-mason.
yeah. But that kind of Masonry, though, unfortunately, is not really based on the traditional Freemasonry. It's based on theosophy, and so people wear white robes and do entirely different things, and they don't. And a lot of Masons look down upon it as something that's not really Masonic. Pansophic Freemasonry is rooted in all the true Masonic traditions, and so when women are initiated, they're initiated into the old male mysteries made over for women as well. So, women were initiated, by the way, as Freemasons very early in the 18th century in speculative lodges, but they were banned in the 19th century. The Ultramasonic rites initiated women, and I told you about the late 19th century French Lodge of Human Rights that voted to do this and started co-masonry. And this was accepted as a new and legitimate obedience of Freemasonry. You see, in France, they have what we call the Grand Orient, which is all the denominations of Masonry, and they decide who's a real Mason and who's not. But the English don't like the French at all, because the French, not only did they fight them in the war, in the American Revolutionary War, and the French helped the Americans to beat the British and all that, and it was French Masons and British Masons and American Masons who were heading all those battles. But by about the middle of the 19th century, French Freemasonry decided they would drop the Judeo-Christian definition of God that had to be accepted, that was always accepted by all the others. God was a grandfather up in the sky, so he was the grand architect of the universe. So because they were going to take in Buddhists and other kinds of people who maybe didn't have gods, use their sacred books to bring them in, the British said they were all heretics, and so they cut them off. So the British don't talk to the French Masons. They talk to the American Masons. We're all friends now. And the French talk to the American Masons. We're all friends. So the French accept the Americans accept the French and the British, but the British don't accept the French, and the French and the British are a bunch of, stuck-up people.
And they're right.
And they're right. Okay. And so in the 20th century, they formed what was called the Mixed Lodge of France, the Grand Lodge Mixte de France, and those are the people that established us over in this country, Pansophic Freemasonry. And that's what we do now, but we aren't very active. But I like to initiate women, and I can do so without breaking my Masonic vows, because I'm in a different obedience. So our obedience does women.
All you have to do to get out of that problem is change the definition of the word woman.
And that's a good point, yeah.
Because every individual, every Mason in his third degree promises that, among other things, he will not assist or be present at the making a woman a Mason. So all you have to do is change that definition so that a woman is I don't know, like a cup of tea or something. And then you have, when you initiate somebody, it's just a human that you're initiating. So, because if you don't do that, then none of those guys will ever be able to be in a lodge with a woman, because they promised, that was part of the thing to get there, that you know, if a woman was like there, you got up and walked out. And I mean, you're sworn to it.
So how did you get around that yourself, then?
No. Well, but that's true for that lodge. Like, you would probably get up and walk out if a woman went into your lodge in San Jose. But
I
if you're
would
also, but so that obedience is for that lodge.
Yeah,
now,
but
if you're also in a different lodge with a different obedience, it's a different issue.
Well,
I mean,
that,
separate issue. You promised not to do it there.
Well,
and you don't
yeah,
do it
but
there.
what they would do then
Thinking this
is
was
they would
common.
hold a trial, and they would convict me of unmasonic conduct, and I'd be thrust out of the fraternity. And it doesn't matter. I could use the excuse I'm in another obedience, but I still belong to that one.
Yeah.
And so, you know, these ideas that we're dealing with now, you know, were, to me, I hadn't even gotten there yet.
It's very
So,
dangerous for.
You're going to have to choose eventually.
No,
is what
no,
you're saying.
no. He's
No.
not going to have to choose, because male, female Freemasonry will never become very strong. It'll just die with the rest of Freemasonry, because it's a male mystery that has just been messed with, unless Freemasonry does a big change. But what I was going to say about it is that the anti-comasonic vow that a Mason has to take, that he will never make a woman a Mason, etc., is a matter of the obedience he belongs to ultimately, because there are, for example, in France, there are comasonic obediences, and if you're a member of the Mixed Lodge of France, for example, you are accepted into a lodge of American Masons. I saw a Grand Master of Mixed Lodge come in and get grand, be given all the highest welcome and grand honors for coming in. I'm not sure they really understood he was from the Mixed Lodge, but
Well, those are also the public grand honors, which can be done in public.
Yeah.
They're not the private grand honors.
Yeah, that's true. But anyway, so it's a very tight thing. But anyway, women were admitted finally, formally, into actual things in Freemasonry, but they were always admitted into the trans-Masonic or the ultra-Masonic orders. Today, if you can go to a lodge of Memphis and Mesmerism, of which there is one legitimate one on the East Coast and one over here that I'm Grand Master of, and you can women can be admitted just as equally as men. So that's been the push that I've made in Masonry, and I've got myself a lot of hot water, and I've made a lot of deals, and I've talked to a lot of high order Masons in various parts of the country, and I got a finally don't ask, don't tell deal with the California Grand Lodge and things like that. So it's all the members of Pan-Sophic are totally there are no records kept. There's no way for anyone to find out who members are, and people who are regular Masons that are men that might join and be affiliated. There's no way for that to be found out, and they don't ask and we don't tell, so that's how that goes.
Well, also, though, the requirements to become a Master Mason in the Pan-Sophic are so demanding that only a tiny percentage of people would ever do all of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been in the Masons 25 years now almost, and I still don't qualify to be a Master Mason in Pan-Sophic. I'll get there eventually, but you have to go through the Home Temple program, the THG program, all of that stuff, plus additional study. And so,
well, no, you have to have gone through two different initiatic paths and some stuff like that. But anyway.
well, one of them's THG, and then one's
Well, actually, we have 5 of them that 5 or 6 of them that do work, but that's a different issue. I want to move on here. So I want you to take a look at the combined Memphis and Mesmerism rites. It's now combined into 99 degrees, and this is just the rite of Memphis. So here you have the degrees of the Oriental Rite of Memphis, The first series is the historical, ethical, symbolic, and philosophical degrees. You go through a separate a separate apprentice, companion, and master. So if you're already a master mason, you still have to go through these. They have their first degree, and they accept women as well as men. And so here we go to the Royal Arch degree, which is degree number 13. Then we get into the second class of degrees, which go to things that come from Scottish Rite and other kinds of things. And it gets up to the 26th degree. A third class of things that go up to the 30, and a second series go up to the 36 degrees. This is the Knight Philalethes, Knight of the Holy City. Philalethes is a pen name of a person who eventually the Philalethes Society was named after in Masonic work. Then you have a fourth class of degrees that takes you through all these things involve these studies you have to pass and all these kinds of things you do. They're not really, it can take you a long time to get here, but it's not any harder than it is to go through other things. And then you get a fifth class that'll take you to the Sublime Sage of the Labyrinth, or Knight of the Temple of Truth, or Prince of the Golden Fleece, or Sublime Unknown Philosopher. And then you can go to the next class. Anyway, go all the way up to 99 degrees. The last 2 degrees are administrative degrees. So what you'll see before you is 97 degrees, Grand Hierophant. So that's a development from the 19th century.
That's why at the opening of the Scottish Rite, they always say of which jurisdiction, of which there's two, and where the sea is. And then they say of the 33rd and last degree.
Yeah.
They make that a doctrinal point. They set the limit, and anything beyond that doesn't exist, at least in their universe.
Well, needless to say, all these degrees of Memphis are not probably staged anymore and put on. It would be, you'd have to be a millionaire to have all the paraphernalia, do all the stuff. We don't have the kind of time we had in the 19th century to do these kinds of things, and so it's not done. Thank you.
Is there any relationship of the 99 things to the 99 names of God in Islam?
I don't know. I don't have a clue. I don't know. Well, now let's move on to another topic. Mesmer. Mesmer was a very brilliant person who discovered what was known as Fohat, animal magnetism. It was part of the, hypnotism was a later development. But in India, people had already had for centuries and centuries used hypnotic techniques to do things and make things appear and disappear and all kinds of things. Blavatsky probably used those techniques of suggestion to make people think that suddenly a giant grand piano had appeared out of nothing in her living room, and she did it to all kinds of rational scientists and things to show them that they weren't so smart after all and things like that, and they weren't. But Mesmer at the beginning of the 19th century became quite a sensation because he learned that he could help cure people of diseases and do other kinds of things using what was called animal magnetism. And it was known as Fohat. You will read about it later in theosophical literature. There was a tremendous fascination with seances and psychic phenomena that had been going on before the French Revolution and went right on afterwards. You can read in Tale of Two Cities at the very first page or two, he talks about the seances that they're doing, spiritual things and so on. And this all developed into the Spiritist movement, which became the Spiritualist movement in churches. But I'm not saying it all comes from Mesmer, but the ideas of Mesmer became very important. The idea that the mind could control or have more to say about what the body was doing and the health was doing was a very new kind of concept. It became eventually part of what was called New Thought, and it became the precursor to Christian Science and things like that. Magic was going strong. We talked about theurgical operations before, goetic magic to invoke and command the lower powers, angels, demons. Dr. Faustus has written. It's still a very major concern. is written in the 19th century, and the story of is that Faustus was actually a historical man who is a scholar and a theurgical operator and so on from many earlier centuries in Germany. Here's an example of a seal to command a lower or fallen angel. We've studied this before in another section. We studied how these seals are developed and how the sigils are made and so on, but they became much more complex in the 19th century. Hermetic magic was used to invoke angels of the high heavens, to bring the high heavenly forces into the earth and bless the earth, using sigils and names and so on. Although angels can be pretty ugly looking, according to some of the invocations of angels. This kind of thing, though, the invoking of beings, was used by Neoplatonists like Plotinus and Iamblichus, and those kinds of, what they had to say about it was very carefully studied. And what they did it for, as opposed to goetic magic, what they did Hermetic magic for was to seek guidance from your higher self, your guardian angel, your algoides, which means your golden body, your golden image. And the algoides is called the guardian angel by some people. The golden dawn, in the highest degrees of the golden dawn, they do operations to seek to have a communication with your guardian angel, with your higher self. So the idea was to evoke or invoke this. And this was introduced into the seances and the spiritism of the century. Now, the deep occultists, like Martinez de Pasquales, who was a great Kabbalist, used a lot of these kinds of techniques when he developed the school of the Elu Cohen. And we're going to look at this now. This kind of magic, evocational or angel magic, probably started in priestly communion with dead ancestors and gods, not to call up evil beings. You've got a lot of recipes in Greek and Hebrew and the Demotic magical papyri, and they're basically virtually the same as the ones you find transmitted by the Arabs to the European Renaissance scholars. You can find them. They're very ancient. They even use Persian and Hebrew names, and the Hebrew fallen angels, as we studied in the other thing, are names based on Zoroastrian deity names that were learned during the Babylonian captivity. So it's all pretty ancient stuff. And the Hebrew archangelic names like Uriel are hypostases of El, of God. Every angel is a something El, Uriel or Oriel or Raphael or Gabriel and so on. And then there were other magical operations that were known to people like Nostradamus and probably used, that came through Druidic transmissions in the Celtic Grail tradition. And evocational magic was not black magic, it wasn't white magic, it was used for gaining power and for gaining knowledge. And it was not used to curse people and bless people and to get money. You might recall that Shakespeare's Prospero in The Tempest throws away his magical books after he resolves all the karma, after all the bad guys are punished and the good guys are rewarded and everything is equal again. And so magic, to do it, it was considered to be impious still, because human beings shouldn't have that kind of power and so on. But in the 19th century, it began to be used in Hermetic tradition as a means of divine communion, almost like a communion service. So it was no longer considered to be impious. The vision of man as a divine being was, well, he had a right to make these communications and to exercise these powers. So this is what was starting to be used at the beginning of the 19th century, and also experimented with by idiots who would do things and get themselves in big trouble. Now, Martinism and Martinism refer to the Grand Master Martinez de Pasquale, who established what we call Martinism, which is confused with Martinism because San Martin was his greatest student, but he developed a very different school than Martinez de Pasquale. Martinez de Pasquale is is kind of hard to find historically. We know that his name was Jacques de Louvain Joachim de la Tour de la Casa Martinez de Pasquale. No wonder we can't find him. He was a Spanish Jew, and later he was baptized, and he was sort of born in the mid-1700s, but he was one of the greatest occult masters of his age, and he was a Kabbalistic master. He was chartered in 1738 by the Scottish King Charles Stuart as a perpetual Grand Master to, quote, erect temples to the glory of the Grand Architect. So he was, not a democratic lodge master. He was an appointed Grand Master. He was a true adept. And he established what was called the Order of Knight Masons, the elect priests of the universe, the Order of the Elu Cohen, the elect priests. 9 members. It was Kabbalistic, and they did most of their operations on the equinoxes, and they were operations to communicate and make communion with the high angelic beings. And there was a degree there were degrees that were established as part of the Elu Cohen. It was sort of like on a Masonic form and basis. And there were secret higher degrees. The secret higher degree was the Rue Croix, which does not mean Rose Cross, and it had nothing to do with Rosicrucianism. It was for one who had finally made contact with his Algoides, with his guardian angel, so to speak. And that was the criterion. When you had done that, you became a Rue Croix. Now, there was one of his students was named Willermotes, and he tried unsuccessfully to have these Elu Cohen degrees regularized in Freemasonry, and he finally achieved the Rue Croix degree after years of theurgical effort. It took him years and years to get there. And the very last adept of this order died in 1868, and then the order went dormant. There was no one to carry it on. The most brilliant disciple of Martinez was Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin. And he studied with this inner Rue Croix group evoking angels, and he was a very talented person. During the French Revolution, he was imprisoned to have his head chopped off, and he got a miraculous rescue from that period, which was that event which is known as the Terror in the French Revolution. And so he escaped with his head. He disavowed Kabbalistic magic, and he turned his attention to philosophy and Pythagorean studies, and traveled worldwide and transmitted teachings. He wrote a book called A Man of Desire, which is meanings a spiritual desire, and so on, which has been translated into English. And he is the basis of what is called the Martinist schools and Martinist orders, which are very alive and very vibrant today, but they are very much different than what he himself established. He gave most of his advanced students what was called La Initiation, the initiation, which gave them the power to teach and transmit initiation from the order of the unknown philosophers. That meant the anonymous philosophers. The idea was that you were, your work in society was anonymous, you didn't proclaim yourself, and you had gained internal powers and internal knowledge. And the first degree was known as the SI, the Superior Inconu. It translates literally as a superior unknown, the unknown superior, but we don't translate it that way usually, as in that sort of way. There was by the middle or late part of the 19th century, there was a lot of emphasis on Spiritism and Spiritualism. And Martinism, Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin had died, and what he had passed on to other people was perpetuated as what we call Martinism. He didn't like Masonic orders. He in fact resigned as a Master Mason in 1790, but because it was, Masonry was where everything was synthesized, and it was the synthesizer and abbreviator of esoteric orders, Martinism was organized on a Masonic basis, and that's how it was actually transmitted into the 20th century. Gerard and Cost, known as Papas, organized ultramasonic order with 3 or 4 levels. Women were admitted, and it was associated with the French Gnostic churches. So you had a first degree, a second degree, a third degree. Instead of the initiation, you had 3-part initiation, and then you got a 4th part, which was administrative, and then it was the 4th level was the person who could do the initiating, and then there were even higher levels. And then some of the later orders, they didn't even admit women, Masonic orders. They paralleled the Masonic initiations, and they excluded women. And there are many Martinist orders today, each claiming to be the most authentic, and a free initiator is now called an SI4, and that's what I am. And the Martinist Order of the Temple, which I head, is allied with the OMCC, which is Martinist Order of the Knights of Christ, which has now been disenchartered by the French Grand Master, and they've reorganized under another name. And they have extensive esoteric and wisdom school teaching site at the site I'm showing you, www.wisdomtraditions.org. And that's a site you might want to explore. Here are some of the archangels of Pasquale's Elucoan. This is Uriel, or Uriel, which is the light of God. That's his seal. This is the seal of Michael, the seal of Gabriel, the seal of Raphael, and the main seal of the Elucoan. This is a seal developed for the equinox of the year 1772. It's 4 theurgical circles and 4 directions of 4 archangels, and that was at a time when equinox ceremonies were done and evocations. Here are circles for the evocation of angelic beings, and they are in the east, west, north, south. They're positioned a certain way. If any of you goes on to the second order, Christ Melchizedek Tantra, you'll find that some of this has been incorporated into some of the levels of generation stages, something similar to this. So Saint Martin, who is known as the unknown philosopher, or the superior inconu, which I translate as anonymous adept. Here's a link to his biography and writings translated into English, and if you want to order an ebook translation of the classic book, The Man of Desire, this is the place you would go to get that. Now, the French Grandmaster Remy Boyer, who's not related to George Boyer, he's from the lineages of Blanchard and Ambelin. He initiated Bishop Asturizaga as a free initiator in 1994, who initiated me in 1995, who initiated Bishop Zohariel in 1996, who chartered OMCC in North America, and so on. This is the place you go for that. Zohariel was chartered by me to translate THG into Spanish and offer it to Hispanics, and there's now a very large Spanish-speaking THG presence in Central and South America, as well as in the U.S. And he established the Wisdom Traditions OMCC Martinist Rosicrucian website for distance learning. But in 2006, Grandmaster Boyer in France withdrew the charter for it. I have no idea why or what the whole issue was. And Zohariel reincorporated on his own authority as a free initiator, and then Bishop Storley was in charge of it for a while, and now Bishop Ratziel is in charge of it. But it's a very, very good site, and they have excellent courses in Rosicrucian and Martinist topics. So I would encourage anyone who wants to explore further, that's a very good way to do it.